The cosmological argument. I love this one. Nice and philosophically rich, and also got a little bit of science that goes behind it. This is part 2 of our 12-week series on apologetics. I gotta be honest, it's gonna be kind of tough to keep this one from getting very technical, but some of the stuff here is potentially very helpful, especially with going forward through this series. Now, last week, it was the intro to apologetics, so just kind of raised the awareness of the issue, made a biblical case for the practice of apologetics, talked about culturally what's the necessary component for apologetics, and determined that in order to create the strongest generation of Christ followers, we need something like this. We need to be able to present critical thinking and rationality, philosophy, science, and evidence to go behind the Christian faith. There's a lot of criticism, there's a lot of attacks on the Christian faith. A lot of it is misguided, a lot of it's political. Some of it's more philosophical, and some of it's kind of emotional in nature. So for various reasons, we need to have good arguments, good methods of discussion, and a good reason to believe the Christian faith, so that these challenges can serve as a strengthening device rather than as a defeating device. And one of the things that's being challenged is the very existence of God. And it's almost like an unprecedented time in our culture that people so often are saying God does not exist. Sometimes we just look at it and think, well, they're just rebellious at heart. But that their hearts are being confirmed through certain kinds of philosophy that they choose to look at. And after looking at some of this, there are so many better explanations for the way things are on theism, if God exists, than on atheism, if God doesn't exist. And I think we could do a good job to both build up our own faith and build up the faith of others through arguments for God's existence. And we should be able to also go to unbelievers, present these, and maybe help them make that step toward faith. But if you present an argument like this to somebody who's an atheist or hard agnostic, how much do I think you're going to convince them? Because I think what's going to happen is you're going to present the argument, they're going to reject the argument, and you're going to come back to me, you're going to come back to apologetics at large and say, this stuff doesn't work. That's the wrong conclusion. If we're about glorifying God first, presenting good evidence for Him, thinking well about who He is and how we can show who He is itself honorable to God. And He moves in those situations. And I've heard testimonies of people coming to faith through the cosmological argument. But another thing we need to keep in mind when we're presenting things like this is that we're not creating change in an instant. God does that, sure. But the influence that we have is done through time, is done across time. And we're not going to be the only influence on a person. So I've shared this argument with somebody, had it rejected, but that influence continues to be there, and that's pretty evident. But you also need to remember to share these things in modesty and in grace, as 1 Peter 3:15 commands. It teaches to have reasons to believe, teaches to have Christ first, and it also teaches to do these with humbleness and reverence, knowing that God is our judge in how we do this. So can you tell the difference between these two? Can you prove to me God exists? Versus, can you offer proof that God exists? There's one of these that you can do and one of these that you can't do. It may be that you present a nice, solid, cogent argument, and yet the person decides to not believe it. They might say, well, science is still hanging, and science will figure it out one day, so I will hold out that there's nothing like a transcendent creator. You've offered proof, but you didn't prove it to them. Proof is different from persuasion. So the quality of this argument is not in how readily somebody accepts it. But I do believe that if they're open, if they're thinking carefully, they will see a reason they should believe in God. So no, don't seek to prove it to a person, but open the door so that they can see that proof, see the evidence. That's our goal here. Let me address a hesitation that some people have about proving God's existence. Some say that if you prove that God exists, then that makes faith a moot point. You need uncertainty in order for faith to be present. On the contrary, the more your uncertainty is overcome, the more likely you are to place trust in what you know to be the case. There's a biblical case for this. The disciples Paul and John all affirm this. The disciples said in John chapter 6, verse 69, "We have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." Belief and know are intertwined, strengthening each other. Paul said in 2 Timothy 1:12, "I know whom I have believed, and I am convinced." Know, belief, and convincing are intertwined, strengthening each other. And John said in 1 John 4:16, "We have come to know and have believed." Knowledge supports belief. Certainty supports belief. You tend to trust in the things that you are the most certain of. That's why certainty and fullness of certainty in the existence of God supports faith rather than opposes it. And I have a chart here that is a very simple line showing that as certainty increases, trust also increases. And if you are certain but fail to put trust, that's unreasonable. But if you put trust in something and there's very little certainty for it, we call that naive. So we have a living zone that balances what we are certain of and what we trust. So if you want your trust in God to increase, become more certain of His existence and who He is. Proof. What do we mean by proof? If we're offering proof for God's existence, we should know a little bit what proof looks like. And this means we're going to have a little examination of something I like to call logic. I'm sure you've heard of it, and I'm sure you've used it extensively throughout your life. So let's have a little overview, and this will help us form a model for what a good proof for God's existence looks like. In this case, the cosmological argument. But with this model, I think it'll help keep in mind, as we move through the Apologetics series, what goes into a good argument. And when it's constructed correctly, you can attain logical proof. That doesn't mean everyone's going to accept it. That doesn't mean you presented it in a perfect way. But it does mean that logical proof in a philosophical, logical sense has been attained. So here's what we need to do. And we're going to move through these steps like a ladder. If at any point we have to answer no, we have to throw what we're saying into the not proof bucket. It's like a trash can, a recycle bin, or something like that. And you have to start over. So, first thing that makes a proof is, does it make a claim? Does it make a claim in the first place? A claim also has to be testable. We have this with the Bible. We can say, is the Bible historically accurate? Does it contain internal contradictions? Is it transmitted correctly? And we'll look at those things. That's just a teaser for a couple weeks from now. What would non-testable be? Well, here's an example from the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon was written on gold plates that Joseph Smith translated, but the gold plates were removed from our earthly existence and taken back to heaven. That's not a testable claim. If it's removed from sight, we cannot test it. A claim also has to be able to survive its own test. What's an example of something that cannot survive its own test? That would be an error in logic called a self-defeating statement. And I get a strange sense of enjoyment out of identifying self-defeating statements, especially because they've become really common in postmodern thought. Postmodernism says, all truth is relative. Then the statement that all truth is relative is also relative, and I don't have to accept it in all circumstances, but that's what they expect me to do. It's self-defeating. Or they say, we can't know truth. Well, you're claiming that statement to be true and something that you know, so apparently you can know truth. If you can't know truth, you can't know that statement. It's self-defeating. Or they'll say there are no absolutely true statements. If there are no absolutely true statements, that statement itself is not absolutely true, and I have no business accepting it. Why did you say it? It's self-defeating. The self-upholding twist on truth would be that truth is objective, that it's discoverable and verifiable, we can know it, and that there are absolutely true statements. Just something to watch out for. Do the premises link? So if we're talking about formal logic, we've got two premises and a conclusion. That's the ideal way to form an argument. And you can link conclusions with new premises and come to more conclusions. But basically what we're trying to do is have two premises, one claim, a supporting claim, and then a conclusion that follows from it. And that's what we're going to have in the cosmological argument. So for example, if I drop a ball, the ball falls. I drop the ball. All right, those are premises that link. It's like if A, then B. A. Or all A is B. A. You should know what comes next, but hang on. If the premises don't link, you might have something like, if I drop a ball, it'll fall. It's wet outside. No link. Okay, premises have to link. Those are oversimplified, but we'll relate it to the argument in a moment. Now, if the premises link, that doesn't automatically make a good argument. The conclusion itself has to follow from the linking premises. It should be, therefore the ball falls, right? If I drop a ball, the ball falls. I drop the ball, therefore the ball falls. Okay, true premises, a conclusion that follows. It happens to be true also, or necessarily true if it follows the premises. But if the conclusion does not follow, you might have something like, if I drop the ball will fall. I drop the ball, therefore it's raining outside. All right? And you can't say that the conclusion is false, that it's not raining outside, but it's a bad way to come to that conclusion. You cannot make that conclusion from those premises. What about this one? This one's getting a little more tricky and could be really helpful, actually, to try to think through. A little more of a gray area, see what you think. If I drop the ball will fall. The ball falls, therefore I drop the ball. Does the conclusion follow? You might think, yes. The ball fell, so you dropped it. But that's not actually what the premise was communicating. The premise is communicating, if I drop the ball will fall. So the second premise needs to be, I drop the ball. Because there's a chance that the ball can fall without me dropping it. If I hang on to the ball and lower it to the ground, the ball falls without me dropping it. So you need to carefully look at the premises to make sure that they actually link properly with the conclusion. And that's just one of the logical fallacies to look out for, and I'd encourage you to look more into logical fallacies and the process of logic. It's pretty fascinating, I think. If we had more time, I'd love to look at some more practical ones, especially as they relate to sharing your faith. All right, finally, the one big missing piece that hopefully you can tell is missing, it's the question, are the premises true? If I drop the ball, it will fall. Yeah, that's a true premise. I drop the ball, it's conditionally true. I can drop the ball. There's all kinds of examples of false premises. So you need to ask, are the premises true? Obviously. And sometimes this is all people focus on is, are the premises true? And to be fair, it is the most important point. But there's more to logic than true premises, because you can have true premises and a conclusion that does not follow. So you need valid logic, true premises, giving you a sound argument. All right, that's what we're after here. Let's apply this to the cosmological argument. Here are the 3 steps to the cosmological argument. Whatever begins to exist needs a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. We may instantly think that is good, that is solid, that is logical. Let's try to uncover it some more. And notice that the conclusion is pretty modest here. The universe has a cause. There may be some atheists who say, okay, I'm fine with the universe having a cause. I still don't believe in God. I still don't believe God's that cause. So we'll look at that shortly. Now let's apply it to our little ladder here. Does the cosmological argument make a claim? Yeah, it claims that God made the universe essentially, or that the universe at least had a cause that's not itself the universe. So yeah, it makes a claim. But is this claim testable? Can you test whether or not God made the universe? Well, I think so. Is the universe a discoverable thing? If we're discoverable creatures placed in the universe, it seems like whatever placed us in the universe is interested in us discovering it. And it's amazing how many things we can discover about physics and cosmology. So we may be able to test this, and the Discovery Institute is an example of a Christian organization that makes testable models for creation, for intentional creation in the design of the human body through irreducible complexity, specified complexity, things like that. Now, can this claim survive its own test? Well, as long as we're talking about two different things, it can survive its own test. We can't say, can the universe cause its own existence, right? That would be one that maybe couldn't survive its own test. But there's nothing circular about identifying a cause and an effect. As long as these are separate entities, we're good to go. Now, do the premises link in the cosmological argument? Do you remember them? Whatever begins to exist needs a cause, which I think is actually an all A is B type of argument. And second premise, the universe began to exist. So we have A in the first one, the begins to exist and the began to exist. So we have the linking premises there with the aspect of the universe brought in. So all A is B, C, this third thing, C is A. The conclusion should follow from that. So good premises. And does the conclusion follow? Right? What would the conclusion be to this? If we look at it just with the letters. All A is B, C is A, therefore C is B, right? Okay, that would be the valid conclusion, and that is exactly what we have in the argument. So therefore the universe had a cause, so C is B. So formally, the logic is great. And I've really never heard of a careful atheist of any philosophical thinking determine that the logic is not good in the cosmological argument. So what do you have to do if the logic is valid? What would an atheist have to do? They would have to deny one of the premises. So to that question we move. Are the premises true? Well, whatever begins to exist needs a cause. Let's think about that. Are there examples of things that begin to exist without a cause? As William Lane Craig has said, if it's true that things can come into existence without a cause, why don't we see that happening all the time? Why don't we see bicycles and BMWs and a nice candy bar right here come into existence without a cause? Or even a single subatomic particle. It just doesn't happen. In fact, that's a basic law of science, that from nothing, nothing comes, and that matter can neither be created nor destroyed within this system. So that would seem to violate any claim that something comes into existence without a cause. But in fact, all we see are effects that have preceding causes. Every effect has this preceding cause. Let's say you go out in your driveway. Someone is standing right next to your car. You hear a crash, and you see that your window has been smashed in. This is the only person standing there. You say, "Hey, what did you do to my window?" And they say, "You know what? This big steel ball just came into existence and crashed into that window out of nowhere, and it just, boom, this happened." You're not going to say, "Well, lucky for you, things happen without a cause all the time. Otherwise, I would have thought that you did that." Doesn't stand up in court, doesn't stand up with science, and we see no examples of things happening without some preceding cause behind them. Now, coming into existence is kind of an interesting thing to think about. I saw one objection to this from a young atheist that said we've never really observed anything come into existence because everything's always been here. We're within the system of things, we're within this system of matter in which matter is never added or being taken away from the system. So no, we've never seen anything come into existence. So you can't really claim that things that begin to exist have a cause or not. Well, that's beside the point. That's for the creation of matter itself, which is an event that happened at a moment in the past. But what we do see is the principle of causation. We see that effects equal preceding causes. There's a sufficient cause that goes into every effect. All right, what explains the universe in those terms? And did the universe itself have a beginning? Well, how are you supposed to know that? You can't go back in time and see. Well, back in time is a very interesting concept. If we think of time as a chain, and maybe the last chain as the moment now, picture traversing back through these moments across the chain. Is the chain grounded in something on the other end, or does it just continue on forever? Where does the chain begin? There's a couple possible answers to this. It doesn't begin. It goes on forever. Or it just is, which is kind of a conversation stopper. Or some quantifiable point. Right? What if you tug on the chain and you feel that it's locked into something? You could say, well, it just goes on forever. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is, summarizing this statement here, any quantifiable characteristic must be explained by a limited quantity. Any quantifiable, anything that can be numbered, must be explained by a limited quantity. Why is that? Because infinity does not actually exist in anything. Something can be boundless, like immeasurably powerful attributes of God. At the same time, there's not a quantifiable characteristic of God. We don't speak of God as traversing finite points of time. We speak of him as eternal. Now imagine this. A student gets in trouble in the classroom, and the teacher says, you know what, I'm going to give you a major punishment. You need to count down, not from 100, not from 1,000. You have to count down from infinity to 0 before you go out to recess. Student hangs his head and says, all right. They go out to recess. Student begins counting down. Teacher walks back in the room to check on him. He's down at 20, 19, 18, 17, almost there. And gets down to 0, right? Now, does the teacher know that the student is lying about counting down to 0? Absolutely, the teacher would know. Why? Because it's impossible to count down from infinity to 0. How does that relate? If we're at the point now, then we have counted down across an infinite sequence of moments in order to get to now. We have, in a sense, counted down to 0. And it doesn't matter how fast you count, you will never count down to 0. You will never go to the point now if you've needed to traverse an infinite number of points to get there. Now consider the absurdity of infinity in another way. Let's say there's a pile of pennies, okay? An infinite pile of pennies. Now somebody wants to borrow some money. And you say, that's fine, I'll give you $100 in pennies for my infinite pile. So now this person has 10,000 pennies, and yet you actually have the same number of pennies. You still have an infinite number of pennies. Weird. Okay, let's say somebody just wants the pennies from, I don't know, the year 2000 out of the pile. Maybe it's 1 out of 40 pennies or something like that. Okay, so 1 out of 40 pennies. So now a person has 1/40th of the pennies from the pile, and yet has an infinite number of pennies because the pile is infinite. So now there's an infinite pile of pennies here that's actually 1/40th of the size of the infinite pile of pennies here. And you've come across a contradiction. You've broken the law of identity that says a thing is what it is. So with this pile of pennies, you have an infinite pile that's 1/40th of the size of this other infinite pile. They're both equal and non-equal at the same time in the same way. It's absurd. It cannot exist. And for such reasons like that, quantifiable infinites cannot exist. Okay, great. So let's do this. Let's think of time as a cycle. This is kind of known as the B theory of time. I'm pretty unconvinced by it, although it does seem to mimic a little bit God's perspective of time, as he views all of time kind of as one moment, viewing it from the outside. But our experience of it is sequential. So in this chain, we can still have a sequence. We will just eventually come back to the same sequence. So where does that chain begin? We've got our limited quantity. We don't have a beginning point. We've escaped that. Well, what's the problem? The problem here is, I guess I'd term it circular causation. Each link is dependent on the link before it, meaning each link is also dependent upon itself, and it depends on the link that directly depends on it. That too gets into some contradictions. Any set of dependent things owes its being to a non-dependent thing. So you can't have a sequence of dependent things depending on the preceding and not have some non-dependent thing in there. In the case of a chain, the non-dependent thing would be that which assembled the chain. So you'd never walk up on a chain like this and assume that it's just been there forever, that it didn't have some beginning link. It's still finite, it's still dependent, even if you were to think about time in this very non-intuitive way. All that to say, amidst the challenges and some of the distractions, it seems certain that this sequence we are in had a beginning, and that it's impossible to have an infinite regress of finite causes. You have to cement that into one independent thing that itself does not need an explanation for its being. That this chain of cause and effect must stop at some uncaused cause. Being would be part of its essence, a very rich description of one of the aspects of God. There's a second escape, and it has to do with quantum mechanics. Even talking to PhD students in physics, I've heard very different stories about what quantum mechanics is like. It's a very mysterious thing, and it kind of can lead you to think what you want to think. I've heard quantum mechanics used to defend atheism, and I've heard it used to defend theism. I've heard it used to defend miracles and loopholes to other universes, the legitimacy of free will, and the beauty of God, and things like that. And I think since it's so uncertain, it's not very useful in involving it to try to make explanations for the way that things are. But science is advancing so quickly, right, that we should be getting to a point where we understand these wonderful things about quantum mechanics, and it'll either lend credence to something like the cosmological argument, or maybe it'll be just a mysterious, spontaneous thing that we understand a little better, or what is it? Now, I have my hunch that there's complete order to quantum mechanics, but there may be complete order that we can never really attain. William Lane Craig has kind of clued me into something about this, and it's with the fact that science is coming to an endpoint. It may never, just by the limitations of instruments, may never be able to really figure these things out. He said, in sum, we shouldn't be misled by appeals to purely theoretical claims in abstraction from what the physical evidence indicates is actually the case. I also observe that if George Ellis is correct that we have reached the physical and observational limits possible for human beings, then these conclusions will not and cannot be overturned by any future scientific discoveries. In other words, the beginning of the universe from nothing is something that science cannot possibly overthrow. If Ellis is correct, here's what Ellis says. So we can see at the largest and smallest scales is approaching what will ever be possible, except for refining some details. Barring something very unforeseen, the possible tests of the very large and the very small are coming towards the limits of whatever will be possible. We're coming to the limits of whatever is possible. We can't make atomic colliders larger than the Earth, is something he gets into. So instrument limitations is bringing us kind of to the end of speculation about quantum mechanics. And that's why quantum mechanics at this point, from my understanding, is largely mathematical and not observable. So, uncertainty, I argue that quantum mechanics is nothing but a desperate attempt to try to avoid the conclusion of the cosmological argument. Just like this guy does. Lawrence Krauss uses these things like quantum mechanics and tries to get a lot of mileage out of the uncertainty therein, and sees just to write a book called A Universe from Nothing. The problem is, he doesn't use the term nothing consistently. This is called the fallacy of equivocation. In one sense, he uses nothing to mean nothing. No potential, no space, no time, no nothing. But if, as he reveals, if you need to get a universe, you need to invoke something. So what he does is invoke a mysterious aspect of the universe, namely quantum mechanics, to try to explain why something like that could eventually bring about what we have now as a universe. So it's bad philosophy. There's probably some good science to it, but it is not a reason to overthrow the cosmological argument. It does not escape the absolute beginning. Okay, back on the question of whether the premises are true. Does whatever begin to exist need a cause? Yes. Did the universe have a beginning? Yes. We showed that philosophically. There's also great scientific evidence for a beginning point. Orderly things are always tending toward disorder. That's why you always have to tell your kids to clean their room. Get the law of thermodynamics. The amount of usable energy is always going down. Matter is not created or destroyed within a closed system. And since we have heat now, that shows that this has not been burning forever. Cosmologists are also able to look at the microwave background radiation at the furthest reaches of the observable universe and detect kind of the fuzz noise of the moment of the beginning of the universe. Or they can also detect the red shift of galaxies and stars moving away in all directions. In a sense, every part of the universe is at the center of the universe. It's kind of interesting because it's all moving away from itself. It's expanding. It's not expanding into space. It's just expanding. And these go to show scientifically that the universe had a beginning. It's still burning. It's expanding still. You draw that expansion back. You have a beginning approximately 13.7 billion years ago. Not here to dispute that, but that shows the beginning. Doesn't matter how far back it was. Did it have a beginning? If it had a beginning, it had a beginner. We have logical proof that God exists as the cause of the universe. We can all go home now, close up your books, applaud, celebrate, whatever. But wait. Remember what the conclusion of the argument was. Don't jump to conclusions that aren't there. The conclusion of the argument was that the universe has a cause. Nothing in the argument that says that God is that cause. I've heard an atheist recently really try to hash out this point. He said, I will grant the premises, and the conclusion follows, since it's valid logic, but all that gives you is a cause, not God. You need to take a few extra steps here. How do we get from a cause of the universe to God? Well, a lot of it's based on this principle that the cause is not the result. Okay, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? The cause can't be the same as the result. The result is the universe. The universe is defined as time, space, and matter. Maybe some other aspects of the universe like minds and things like that, but we'll stick with time, space, and matter, things observable by science. That means the cause cannot be those fundamental things. Since the cause created space, the cause is spaceless. Since the cause created matter, the cause is immaterial. And since time is based on space and matter, the cause itself is timeless or eternal. Okay, spaceless, immaterial, timeless being. Eternal and omnipresent. And not made up of constituent finite parts. Interesting. So a law of logic or a law of mathematics is the only other thing I can think of that kind of lines up with these traits. But those can't bring anything about because they have no power. They're conceptual only. They are not themselves a mind thinking of them. They are the results of a mind. In some ways, then, the cause is reflected in the result. How? If you have something that's wound up, you need a winder. If there's a lot of energy in the result, you need something very powerful to infuse that energy. So we have something powerful. We have something intentional. Since this happened at a specified point and not an eternity ago, you have something intentional, designating a certain point at which the beginning would occur. And I think you can even determine the goodness of this being. Since existence itself is good, this being exists, possesses that ultimate goodness, and infuses goodness into the result. So our awareness is good, our existence is good. There is some ultimate good that is possessed in the beginner. So at that point we have a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, or eternal, ever-present, powerful, intentional mind who seems to be good in nature and has seemed to create a world in such a way that certain creatures like us would ask questions about where it came from and what it is. He's created us inquisitive so that we could discover things like this about him. And this isn't just the 21st century. This is even in biblical times. Look at Psalm 19:1. The heavens are telling of the glory of God. Now, certainly the psalmist didn't have all the scientific tools that we have to look at the universe, but could still tell that the heavens are telling the glory of God. He could see himself as dependent. He could see every thing in existence as dependent, and he maybe could see the necessity, the independence of the Creator. He could see just the massive expanse and wonder at the creative power of the Creator. Paul takes this a bit further in Romans 1:20. He is so aware that creation exhibits a Creator that he says that people have no excuse for disbelieving in God. They can't say nobody told me. Says since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Every unbeliever is without excuse. The evidence is here. It's clearly visible. You are without excuse for disbelieving. You know that you are a finite human, set about at a certain point of time, across this process of time, dependent on something else for your existence. We can't have an infinite sequence of dependent things because we would never reach now. The same problem as with time. So if something dependent exists, then something necessary must exist. This is called the contingency argument. It's kind of a branch off the cosmological argument. If something dependent exists, something necessary must exist because there can't be an infinite sequence of dependent things. Just like the circular chain where one is dependent on another, or even the linear chain, one can't be dependent on another, whether it's a B theory of time, an A theory of time, or what. It must ground itself in some necessary being. And this necessary being is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, unimaginably powerful, personal and intentional, and I think good. This is what we call God. This is proof that God is real. Not everyone's going to accept it. Not everyone loves the consequences of it. But it's valid. The premises are almost inescapable. And if I was a neutral observer, as a non-Christian even, if I were to look at this argument, I would say, my goodness, God must exist. My follow-up question any time I come to the conclusion of God's existence is, then what does he deserve from you? If he's real, what does he deserve from you? If you're completely dependent on him, What does he deserve from you? That's a point worth pondering. Hey, next time, Doug's going to take it from here into the design argument. We'll look more into the mind of the Creator, the incredible intelligence and precision that the Creator made this world with. So this is the fact of the Creator. More evidence for the Creator is going to be discovered as we investigate the fine-tuning, the specificity that goes in to all the scientific parameters of the universe, of the planet Earth, of the human body. And until then, give God what he deserves, and God bless and guide you.